we'll just get started then. Okay, so hi, welcome to the Fiveable live stream today. So like I said earlier, we're going to be talking about 3 of the most essential cases in terms of AP government content and curriculum, and I'll get into more about that in a second. But before I do that, you guys should follow Fiveable across all of their social media. Their handle is @ThinkFiveable on Twitter and Instagram and YouTube. So they're pretty easy to find across all platforms because they have the exact same username. Hi, I'm Fatima Raja. I'm a senior in Houston, and I do debate in Model UN, and I went to Washington, D.C. this summer, which is very fitting for talking about AP government. So if you guys are curious about it, you can ask me, and I'm planning on being a liberal arts major in college. Okay, so today in this stream, we're going to be talking about 3 cases, like I said earlier, and those 3 cases are Marbury versus Madison, McCulloch v. Maryland, and the U.S. v. Lopez case. So before we get into it, what is the role of the Supreme Court? So it's one of the 3 branches of federal government, but before we talk about the cases that it's ruled on, why is it so important to the U.S. government in the first place? So you guys can just drop that answer in the chat, and we can talk about your answers. Okay, so for anyone who is not aware, the Supreme Court rules on cases that are pretty much trying to settle disputes. And those disputes can be interstate disputes. So if 2 states have a disagreement on something, it's the Supreme Court's job to resolve it. And it also helps answer constitutional questions. So a lot of times, like as new technology develops and like as a society we progress, there's a lot of different constitutional provisions in terms of the Bill of Rights that get called into question, especially because it was written in like literally hundreds of years ago. So there's new questions that come up all the time, and it's the Supreme Court's job to help answer them. So knowing that, the first case we're going to look at is Marbury v. Madison. And so some context for this case was that Thomas Jefferson defeated John Adams in the 1800 presidential election. And so the reason why this was so important was because on March 4th, 1801, Adams in Congress passed the Judiciary Act of 1801. And so what that act did was it created new courts and added judges and gave the president more control over the appointment of judges. And so what Adams used after he passed that law was he started appointing a bunch of different judges that agreed with his party, the Federalist Party. And so because Jefferson hadn't taken office yet, he couldn't really do anything to stop it. So him being a Democratic Republican, before he had taken office, even though he had already been elected by the people who were able to vote, was pretty much being undermined in terms of his political ideology, because John Adams was literally actively working to ensure Federalist power in the government. So some constitutional questions that were raised because of this whole fiasco were, do plaintiffs have a right to receive their commissions? And can plaintiffs even sue for their commissions in court? And does the Supreme Court have the authority to order their commission be delivered? And so, quick explainer, commission is pretty much like giving the person their job. So delivering their commission would be letting them know, hey, you got the job, and letting them begin working. And so the plaintiffs in this case were the people who had been nominated by John Adams to become judges on the court that he had created and the new judgeship positions. So they were the ones that were suing John Adams. So who was Marbury? So William Marbury was the guy who had been appointed Justice of the Peace for Washington, D.C. So he didn't get his commission, and that was obviously why he decided to sue the federal government over it, because even though he got the job because John Adams said he did, that commission was never actually delivered. So technically, he didn't officially get the job. So he couldn't begin working and like his position of being the justice of peace in Washington, D.C. didn't actually come to fruition. So he was like, this is like, he literally gave it to me. Like, why don't I get the job? Like, that's not fair. And so what Marbury did in response to that is he petitioned the Supreme Court to make James Madison, who was the Secretary of State and like in charge of delivering those documents at the time, to deliver them and let him start working. And so there were also 3 other people in addition to Marbury who also didn't get their commissions. And so they joined that case and joined him in suing the federal government. And so what James Madison, the Secretary of State for Thomas Jefferson, said was the appointment wasn't actually completed because the commission wasn't delivered. So because it was never actually completed, like, and only done halfway, the appointment could be revoked because it wasn't actually finalized. So one of the reasons why he said that was because Thomas Jefferson, who was the president and had at that point in time assumed office, he told James Madison to not give the commission. And so that was pretty much the situation at that point in time. So why do you guys think, what's another reason that James Madison refused to deliver the commission? And so it's okay to like theorize in this case, because like this is why we're here, to learn new things and to find out whether or not we're right about our assumptions. So yeah, feel free to answer in the chat and I'll make sure to answer this question for you guys. So something interesting about this was like, oh yeah, Zoe says that Jefferson told him not to. Yeah, that's true. Okay, so Zoe's right about Jefferson telling him not to, but the reason why James Madison and Jefferson both agreed on why not to do it was because of the fact that they felt that the Federalist government that had been in power before them, so John Adams, they had passed this law specifically to like cement Federalist power within the government after a new government had been chosen. Like, even though at that point in time, Thomas Jefferson hadn't actually assumed office, he had still already won the election of 1800. So James Madison and Thomas Jefferson both felt that this action that John Adams had taken was illegitimate anyways, and so they didn't have to actually deliver the commission. And so they pretty much used the argument of it not being completed in order to like justify that. Okay, so that being known, the important outcomes of Marbury v. Madison were, first, the Supreme Court ruled that it was illegal to not deliver the commission. But even though they said that, they didn't make Madison actually deliver it, because they said that the part of the Judiciary Act of 1789 that had even let Marbury bring his claim to the Supreme Court was unconstitutional. So they said that under most circumstances, like not giving someone their commission after they had been appointed was not allowed. But because the Judiciary Act of 1789 was unconstitutional, that specific commission didn't have to be delivered. And so that was because the Supreme Court Supreme Court ruled that the court's original jurisdiction had gone beyond what the Constitution said. And so it said that the Judiciary Act of 1789 was trying to expand the Supreme Court's power in a way that wasn't actually originally intended. So that made the Judiciary Act of 1789, or that specific part of it, not allowed under the Constitution. And so it said that even though a writ of mandamus was the right way to fix the problem, the Supreme Court wasn't allowed to issue it. And so what a writ of mandamus is that it pretty much is a way for courts to rectify a past issue. So a court can pretty much, like in this case, it would have been like, hey, deliver the commission and let this guy have his job. But it's pretty much a way of the court like fixing issues and pretty much ordering authorities and public officials to do things. And so it said that in most cases, that would be the way to do it. But in this case, the Supreme Court couldn't because the Judiciary Act of 1789 wasn't allowed under the Constitution. And so they also said that one of the reasons it was unconstitutional was because they said that the Judiciary Act of 1789 tried to alter the Constitution by just passing a law. And that's not the way that altering a Constitution works. Like, the way that the process works is that a majority of states have to first ratify whatever amendment has to take place, and then that has to be voted on. And so because that didn't actually happen, and the Judiciary Act just tried to expand federal power and the Supreme Court's power specifically, it wasn't actually allowed. So the most important thing that came out of Marbury v. Madison, now that we understand all the facts of the case, was judicial review. And so the idea of judicial review is incredibly important because it's pretty much the entire purpose of the Supreme Court now. It means that the Supreme Court can rule laws are unconstitutional or parts of laws are unconstitutional. And so if they do that, it means that that law is null and void and it no longer actually can be applicable to whatever area it was passed in. And so that was actually an incredibly smart way to do it, right? Because in that time period, the Supreme Court was viewed as an unjust entity by a lot of people because it was this branch of government that had an extremely large amount of power. It could literally nullify laws by just passing a holding, right? But the justices weren't elected. So a lot of people felt that wasn't actually fair. So by saying that the Supreme Court did have power and it was allowed to review laws, it was pretty much asserting that they had a role in the federal government. But by also saying that Supreme Court power was limited was reassuring to the people that the Supreme Court wasn't going to just try to seize power and decide what laws were actually allowed to be passed. So it was a very smart way to resolve an issue and reassure the American people that the Supreme Court would be a just entity. So that being said, why do you guys think judicial review is so important to the American government? So once again, feel free to just drop your answer in the chat. Okay. So Zoe says unconstitutional laws are nullified. Yeah, that's true. Okay. So there's a lot of reasons that judicial review is so important, but the two main ones are that, that it's another way to check powers. Like the Supreme Court, sorry, give me a sec, pretty much gets to make sure, oh, okay, I'm good. Gets to make sure that unconstitutional laws won't be actually enacted, right? So it can be like, okay, Congress can't pass a law to say that the states have to listen to, are no longer allowed to make their laws. Like the Supreme Court would be able to say that that's an overreach of power and that's not allowed. But another reason is that it allows for specific provisions of laws to be declared unconstitutional. So the Supreme Court doesn't have to strike down every single part of a law if just one part is unconstitutional, not allowed. It can just be like, hey, this one part, not cool. And so moving forward, that part will be null and void. Okay, so now that we know that, let's look at McCulloch v. Maryland. And so this case, some context, is that in 1816, Congress chartered the Second Bank of the United States. And so in 1818, Maryland decided to impose taxes on it. And so there was this guy whose name is, in the Supreme Court case, named James W. McCulloch. And so he worked at the Baltimore branch of the Second Bank of the United States. And so he was like, oh, yeah, Zoe, I will go back to the last slide really quickly. Okay, is that good? Oh, okay, the one about judicial review. So just like let me know when you're like done with this one, and then I'll move on. Okay, so now that we have judicial review down, let's look at the next case, McCulloch v. Maryland. So, like I said, in 1816, Congress chartered the Second Bank of the United States. So what that pretty much means is that it created a bank. So in 1818, the state of Maryland, which like had a branch of the Second Bank within it, started taxing the bank. And so this worker named James W. McCulloch, whose name is in the case, said that he wasn't going to pay taxes that Maryland was imposing. So because James W. McCulloch decided not to pay those taxes, it raised a bunch of different constitutional questions. Like, does Congress even have the authority to establish a bank? And another one was that was Maryland violating the Constitution and interfering with congressional powers by taxing this Second Bank of the United States. And so what McCulloch was saying was that the states aren't allowed to tax a federal entity. And because the Second Bank of the United States was created by Congress and thus a part of the federal government and operating under federal authority, states weren't allowed to tax it. And another thing that McCulloch said was that because federal statutes supersede state statutes, the state's actions violated the Constitution because taxing a bank would make it more difficult for it to operate. And if this bank had to pay taxes, it's possible that Maryland could increase taxes so much that it could take the bank out of business, which would obviously not be great for the federal government. And so what Maryland said was that the Second Bank was unconstitutional. There was nothing in the Constitution even saying that a federal bank could be created. So the government was overreaching its power and trying to abuse like whatever federal power it had. So it was saying that because the federal government and no specific part of the Constitution said that a federal bank can be created, it wasn't allowed. So it was a very strict interpretation of the Constitution. And so, okay, the reason why there's a dinosaur on this slide is because I recently found out that the state dinosaur of Maryland is an Astrodamus. So that is that dinosaur. Fun fact. Okay, but knowing all of those things, not including the information about the dinosaur, what constitutional clause do you guys think isn't applicable to this case? And so you can just say the answer in the chat. And so A is going to be the Commerce Clause, B is the Supremacy Clause, C is the Elastic Clause, and D is the Emoluments Clause. Okay, so Zoe says A, the Commerce Clause. Okay, so the correct answer is actually, oh, so Sandra says C, the Elastic Clause. Okay, so now that you guys have like, let me know what you guys think, I'll explain each of these clauses first. And so like if you reconsider, like you don't have to say your new answer, but it's just something to think about. So the Commerce Clause pretty much says that the US federal government is allowed to regulate interstate commerce and like take actions to regulate like the way business is done within the country. So B, the Supremacy Clause, says that federal actions and laws are superior and supersede state actions. So it means that states can't create laws that are in conflict with federal laws. And so C, the Elastic Clause, means that's also known as the Necessary and Proper Clause, means that pretty much Congress can take actions in order to enforce the laws. So even if Congress like hasn't actually like had a provision in the Constitution saying that it can take an action, if that specific action or law or bill falls under something that will help Congress enforce its other powers that were specified, they're still allowed to pass the law. And so D, the emoluments clause, this is pretty much saying that a person who is within the federal government can't make money off of their position. So they can't abuse their power to profit off of their position within the government. Okay, so that being said, let's look at the important clauses and find out which one isn't actually within the ruling that was delivered. And so the Supreme Court upheld the Supremacy Clause within its ruling. So what the Supremacy Clause says is that laws that are made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. So that means that federal laws nullify state laws, and that states cannot impede exercises of constitutional power that was given to the federal government. So if the federal government decides to exercise one of its powers, the states can't get in the way of that if they disagree with the action, because the Supremacy Clause says that any of the federal actions that are taken that are within the bounds of their constitutional powers will be superior to those taken by the state government. So another one was the Elastic Clause, and this means it's also known as the Necessary and Proper Clause. It says that any laws that are necessary for carrying out the powers given to the federal government in the Constitution are allowed to be made. So saying that they have to actually create a national bank is something that is specified within the Commerce Clause. So Chief Justice John Marshall, he wrote of this case that although it wasn't actually specifically stated that the federal government had the power to create a bank, they still did find that the powers of the federal government included laying taxes, borrowing money, and regulating commerce. So even though there was no words saying that the federal government can create banks as it wishes, the Commerce Clause would allow that to happen because it's a necessary law that Congress would be using to execute its intentions for the Commerce Clause. So now that we know that, we can understand how all of these three clauses interacted with the ruling. And so we know that the state created a law that would interfere with the federal government's ability to carry out its powers. That means the state was violating the Supremacy Clause. And the Supreme Court also found that the Commerce Clause allowed the federal government to regulate commerce and borrow money. And so that means that the creation of the Second Bank of the United States was something that was completely allowed because the Elastic Clause is what allowed it to happen. It meant that Congress could create any government entities beneath it in order to carry out the Commerce Clause. So those were how those three different clauses interacted to make sure that the Second Bank of the United States was allowed to exist. So now that we know all of that, which clause or amendment allows federal laws to nullify state laws? And that's if they're unconstitutional or if the state or the federal government is taking action if that is constitutional. Okay, so Zoe says supremacy, and she's absolutely right. It's the Supremacy Clause that allows that to happen. Okay, so the last case we're going to be looking at today is U.S. v. Lopez. So unlike the last two cases, which took place a hot second ago in the 1800s, this case happened more recently in terms of the federal government existing. It happened in the 90s. So there was this kid named Alfonso Lopez. So he was a senior in high school, and so he brought a concealed weapon to school. And so that wasn't allowed under Texas law. So having a gun at school is something that Texas was not cool, don't do that. So he was charged under the law by the state of Texas for possessing a firearm on school premises. So the state charges were dismissed, and the federal government charged Lopez with violating the Gun-Free School Zones Act of 1990. And so to clarify a little bit, the state charges were dismissed by the federal agents. So like the state did like charge him and like sentence him to prison and that like to serve a prison sentence. But then the federal government intervened and charged him with violating a federal law. So that raised the question, is the 1990 Gun-Free School Zones Act unconstitutional because it exceeds the power of Congress to legislate under the Commerce Clause? And so the reason why this is the question is I'll explain in a second. But the important thing to know about the GFSZA, which is what I'm going to be calling the Gun-Free School Zones Act, is that it forbids people from carrying a gun knowingly in a school zone. So Texas already had a law that didn't allow people to knowingly have guns at school. The federal government just decided that they would be the ones pressing these charges. So what Lopez argued, who was the kid that actually got charged with it, having the gun on school property, was that the Gun-Free School Zones Act was unconstitutional. And he said that because education, so state school or schools and public education, is controlled by state and local governments, they don't fall under the purview of the federal government. So the federal government thus has no authority to charge him with violating a law because they weren't allowed to even interfere with actions that happen on like in the educational area. So what the federal government responded with was it said that it did have the authority to ban guns in schools because of the Commerce Clause. And so what the Commerce Clause says, and specific text with it, is that it regulates commerce with foreign nations among several states and with Indian tribes. And so the thing to know about the Commerce Clause, which isn't included on the slides, but I'll give you guys some background, is that in many cases, it was actually used to help like desegregate areas. So one of the arguments that the federal government made in like courts was that areas that were segregated were less likely to have a lot of patrons. And so thus they were able to like further that like desegregation and making sure that like civil rights were guaranteed through the Commerce Clause. And so that was something that had already happened earlier. So this idea that the Commerce Clause could be applied to things that didn't seem like normal economic activities was something that was pretty much normalized within like court laws and within the court. So the federal government said that guns in school lead to gun violence. And so they cause people to be more reluctant to travel through areas where gun violence had occurred. And so that would lead to a learning environment that is disrupted, which would by extension lead to a citizenry that is less educated, which would hurt commerce. Because if people aren't going to school because their learning environment is disrupted by gun violence, it would mean that there's less people that are pursuing like economic activity that tends to be like more valuable, I want to say, in terms of like the amount of money you get paid, and the amount of money you get paid compared with like having a high school degree or having a college degree is different compared to if you don't have those things. So if someone wasn't able to complete high school, they would earn less money, which would mean that if compared to if they had completed high school and gotten a job, they would be contributing less to the national economy. So the federal government said that it was allowed to regulate gun violence and whether or not guns were in school because it had to make sure that the national economy was protected. So that being said, what clause did the US government use to try to say that it had the power to ban guns from school? So A is the Commerce Clause, B is the Necessary and Proper Clause, and C is the Confrontation Clause. So Sandra and Zoe both say A, and they are both right. It was the Commerce Clause. So that was the argument that the US government was employing. And so the outcome of that case was saying that the law was unconstitutional. So it didn't say that the Commerce Clause was unconstitutional. It said that the Gun-Free the Gun-Free Schools Zones Act was unconstitutional. So it said that having a gun in a local school isn't really an economic activity that like would be repeated. And so it wouldn't have a very large impact on interstate commerce. So it really had nothing to do with economic activity. And so this is something that's like, if you think about it logically, it would be accepted in terms of like having gun control legislation be enforced because of the Commerce Clause. Like, that's not something that would like make sense. So the Supreme Court pretty much said that trying to apply the Commerce Clause to being able to enforce gun control laws and interfere with the state's ability to regulate education isn't something that makes sense. So the law is unconstitutional. So it meant that states would still be allowed to like prosecute and be like the people who are actually in charge of enforcing their gun control legislation and its interaction with schools, and that the federal government couldn't like have this law that said that guns aren't allowed to be in school because it's just not their arena and that's not their job to do. And so when you think about it, that's still okay because like most states have decided that having guns in school isn't something that we want. So like in Texas and in most other states, like you're not allowed to have a gun in school. So that's something that has like solved itself on the state level to some extent. Okay, so knowing that, what's one way that you guys think that the US v. Lopez ruling affects us right now? So it doesn't have to be about gun control, and it like just has to do with how that ruling is interpreted now. So once again, just drop your answer in the chat. So Zoe says that the state has more power to prosecute without the federal government overstepping. So yeah, I would agree with that. The US v. Lopez like ruling that the Supreme Court issued pretty much like led to like states being, or didn't lead to, but like the impact of it was that the Supreme Court affirmed the state's right to regulate education. So the federal government, even if it did have good intentions by trying not to have guns in schools, isn't really allowed to like pass laws to make that decision anyways. Because like, first of all, states are already doing it, but secondly, because of the fact that it's not their job to regulate education. Like the Constitution says that that's a state issue. And so another way that I can think of is that the Supreme Court said that you can't just apply the Commerce Clause to like pretty much everything, because you can argue that the federal government like and everything is connected to like commerce in some way. So creating these arguments that are like very extrapolated from the Commerce Clause is possible, but it's not something that's sound. So Zoe says, should the federal government have used a different clause other than the Commerce Clause to argue their case more effectively? And so the answer to that is a bit complicated because off the top of my head, I can't really think of a federal law that would allow, or a federal constitutional clause that would allow the federal government to enforce a law that would interfere with education, which is something that's like regulated on the state level. So I think that the federal government had a lot of options, and that choosing the Commerce Clause was something that they did because they had been able to apply the Commerce Clause effectively in other cases that were directly related to like federal economic activity, like segregation. And so they had been successful in the past with using the Commerce Clause, so they may have thought that it would work again, but obviously it didn't. So the three main takeaways that I want everyone to remember is that the Supreme Court is pretty much the entity that shapes the scope of federal power. And so in some cases, it has chosen to expand it, but in others, it's chosen to limit federal power, because the Supreme Court at the end of the day is what gets to decide whether the federal government is overstepping. So that's its job, and it has chosen to do it so far in history in terms of the three cases we've talked about today. So that being said, if you guys have any questions, you can ask them now and just drop them in the chat or like use the ask a question button and I will answer them and do my best. Okay, so Zoe asks, why did the federal government want to intrude on this case if Lopez was already sentenced to prison by the state of Texas / already being punished? Okay, so I think the reason why the federal government decided to intervene and like make sure that Lopez was punished on the federal level was to some extent to make sure that the federal government had more power in passing like gun control legislation. So, and enforcing that. And so that was something that the federal government was interested in doing during the passage of that specific law. And so by the Supreme Court ruling that guns could be regulated by the Commerce Clause, the federal government would have more power to pass more laws that were similar to it and could also be upheld under the Commerce Clause. Okay, if you guys don't have any more questions, we will end the stream. So I'll just give you guys a couple more seconds to like answer the poll and to ask any more questions. So it seems that nobody watching the stream today is taking the US History SAT subject test. Yeah, which makes sense. A lot of people take it after their junior year or taking APUSH. Okay, I hope everyone has a great rest of their night. Make sure you guys tune into our weekly current events stream, which is going to be happening at 7:30 Central Time. And if you live in a different time zone, feel free to like Google the conversion. But 7:30 my time, so Central Time. And tune into that because it's happening tonight and it's going to be super interesting. The AP Government lead teacher, Robbie May, is going to be explaining impeachment and how that's affecting like the Trump presidency and pretty much how the impeachment process works. Because we have a lot of assumptions about it and wants to make sure that everyone taking AP Gov understands exactly how it works. And so if you have any friends that are also like trying to keep up with what's happening in the news, make sure you tune in because we're also going to be talking about the 2020 elections. So everyone, hope you have a great night. If you're tuning into the election stream, I'll see you in a few minutes. Bye-bye.